as the situation in Russia continues to get worse, now a record drone attack on Moscow, we are starting to see more conversations about why there still have been no organized protests on the streets. Well, if you have been following this channel for a while, you would know that the basic answer is that the economic downturn has yet to hit average Russians, so there is little direct economic need to protest current policies. Rather, the concerns in front of them are drones buzzing overhead in Moscow, the lingering dread of wondering whether there will be another round of mobilization, and frustration with trying to have reliable access to basic websites. With wage increases still exceeding inflation, the main economic burdens are wondering whether the local gas station will be stocked today, or if flights will be taking off from Moscow. But these are best described as frustrations, whereas protesting can be fatal. So there is your surface answer. Regardless, the interesting thing about this whole conversation is that it fundamentally misunderstands why protests erupt. The common narratives that you will hear in both the media and analyst communities do not appreciate how tacit bargaining from the Kremlin shapes the domestic peace, and that any mistakes that the government makes comes from the associated bargaining frictions. So join me today as we go through 4 phases of bad argumentation. That repression in Russia is just very good, that propaganda in the country is just very good, that the devil that Russians know is better than the devil that Russians don't, and that the Kremlin has fundamentally broken the Russian social contract. Then we will delve into bargaining theory to better understand when exactly Russians will head out to the streets. But let's begin with the repression argument, because it is straightforward. Autocratic governments have security forces that will arrest you if you cause problems on the streets, assuming there are not so many of you out there that the security forces are scared for their own safety. The basic premise of the repression argument is that Russian security forces have been doing this for long enough that there would need to be an incredibly large social movement before they start to think twice about cracking down. Perhaps for other reasons we will discuss in a moment, there is not sufficient consensus to move that many people on the streets right now. Hence, the protests stop before they can start. If I may draw an analogy that you are all familiar with by this point, this would be like saying that wars do not occur because one side is so much more powerful than the other. Yet we know 2 facts about that statement. 1, it is not true. There are plenty of David versus Goliath wars in the history books. And 2, the actual consequential effect of having so much more power over an opponent is the ability to extract more out of them in negotiated settlements. Well, extending that logic to citizen government negotiations, autocratic regimes try to extract as much as they can from their populations. The game that the leader plays is that the more he extracts, the more it antagonizes the population, and the more likely they are to get on the streets to start protesting. If the government is smart, it can match a level of extraction close to what the expected outcome of a civil uprising would produce. Then no one has any reason to protest, because it just incurs risk without any expected reward. In turn, the first-order effect of better security forces is indeed to deter protesting. But the second-order effect is that it allows the leader to try to implement more extractive policies. And thus, the second effect washes out the first effect in terms of whether we would expect to see a revolution. You know, the running theme of this video is extraction. Wouldn't it be nice to just be left alone? But even for those of us with the comfort of not having our governments come after us on a daily basis, you likely have a bunch of personal information still sitting on the internet, just waiting for malicious private actors to take advantage. Personally, I think that breaks a different kind of social contract. But good news. That is where the sponsor of today's video, Incogni, comes in. They will help you remove your information, like home address, employment history, or even political affiliation, from websites and data broker registries. If the bad guys can't find you, the bad guys can't harm you. And with Incogni's custom removal option, you can point them to an exact problem that you might encounter. So shift the balance of power in your favor and take back your personal data by heading to incogni.com/WilliamSpaniel. Use coupon code WilliamSpaniel, all one word, to get 60% off an annual plan. And thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring today's video. The second problematic explanation has a similar theme as the first. By the propaganda argument, the Kremlin is very good at convincing Russian citizens that everything is fine in the country, that everyone else thinks that everything is fine in the country, that whatever is happening in Ukraine is not a big deal, and whatever bad things may be happening in Ukraine are all NATO's fault. Oh, and if there are problems in Russia, it is not the president who is responsible. In fact, if there are problems, then he wants to hear from you. That is why he has his annual marathon call-in show at the end of the year. He will even apologize when he learns about your problems, and you will pledge to task the government with fixing them. Now, we could spend some time sorting out whether anyone in Russia believes those messages. We could discuss how it has been more than 4 years of an invasion now, and that suppressing the truth for that long is difficult. We could discuss how the social networks of those who return from the war, often with debilitating, lifelong injuries, would spread the truth. We could discuss how there is significant resistance to mass mobilization policies, which is difficult to square if the average Russian is oblivious to the facts. Or we could point to the sizable and increasing contract offers to convince citizens to become soldiers, which again is difficult to square if citizens are not increasingly cognizant of the problems. But if the question is about why protests have not yet erupted, we still have the same bargaining critique as before. Propaganda is useful for shaping beliefs, but the better that you are at shaping beliefs, the more that you can extract out of citizens. The two effects wash out once again. You know what else washes out? Fear of what comes next. The basic idea with this argument is that, sure, Vladimir Putin is bad, but do you know who else would be bad? Basically anyone who might follow him. The last guy was a drunk, the one before him was competent but watched Russia's grip over Eastern Europe disappear, and the one before him that could bother to stay alive for more than 2 years was also a drunk. Things just do not get any better in Russia, so why bother protesting? The country will not become a true democracy even if the protests are successful. You will just be replacing the devil that you know with a devil that you don't. And in the meantime, you will have to put yourself at great personal risk by going out on the streets. Well, that pessimism is overstated to some degree. Perhaps it is likely that the next regime will have a similar disposition as the current one, but sometimes revolutions can go over well. Once more, though, the bad future expectations wash out in what the current regime can do. The Kremlin knows that the citizens have this sort of expectation. That makes a revolution less likely for any given policy, which, again, encourages the Kremlin to ratchet up its extraction out of the citizens. At least this fourth explanation has some more nuance. The hypothetical Russian social contract, which you have likely heard of before, is the idea that the Kremlin gets to dictate foreign policy in return for delivering stability at home. This idea, in essence, puts some bones on what exactly is the division between the two parties that is normally on the table. Well, clearly the spirit of that social contract has been broken. The Kremlin continues to do what it wants to do in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russian citizens only have to look up and notice migrating pink birds to understand that their share of the settlement is slowly eroding away. This would seem to play into the bargaining logic from before. If the critical threshold to wide-scale protests was here, the Kremlin used to plant its policies just inside of that breakpoint to guarantee some calm. Russians indeed lived in harmony for a while, and then suddenly the Kremlin stepped over the line. We would expect to see those protests erupt, but they have not. So what gives? The partial answer is that this line of reasoning only looks at the bad things that have happened to Russian citizens as a consequence of the war, while ignoring the good things, like increased wages due to spiking demand for labor. While this has upset Russia's large oligarch class, that appears to have offset most of the other problems in the lives of average citizens, explaining what we are currently observing. I say most because clearly the threat level to the Kremlin is elevated at the moment. You can see this from the internet outages. This is not a step that governments take lightly. Spotty access to the internet is bad for economic productivity, at a time when the Russian government is facing enormous economic challenges on other levels. Nonetheless, the Kremlin imposes outages because it interferes with the ability of Russian citizens to coordinate their actions against the government. The security benefit to the Kremlin exceeds the negative economic effects and the backlash effect of frustrated Russians who just want to get online, so that is why the Kremlin approved it. That still leaves us without an answer to today's main question. When will we start to see significant protests in Russia? And the honest answer is that I do not know, and no one really knows. Someone who tells you such is either lying to you or is oblivious to the underlying incentives. Autocratic governments can reach a point where their authority is shot and all cohesion is gone. At that point, there is nothing that the government can do that will appease the protesters, so one could make somewhat reliable predictions about the future of the country. However, Russia is far from that point. The Kremlin still has plenty of latitude to scale up or draw down the bar of policy concessions and repression to avoid any clear and obvious problems. One way to convince yourself that we, as keyboard warriors, cannot adequately predict when the government will face active resistance is that if we all knew, then certainly the Kremlin would also know, and security forces in the country would take active steps to counteract the threat. That is basically the equilibrium that we are currently in. The government is doing its best to suppress issues when it thinks it identifies them. At some point, something random might happen, government cohesion might be lost, and we can start making bolder predictions about Russia. But we are not there yet. Aside from random incidents that could occur, what strategic problems could lead to marching in the streets of Moscow? At the risk of rehashing how we got here in the first place, the Kremlin is capable of making fundamental miscalculations. Here, rather than the miscalculation being about Ukraine's ability to resist, it would be about how Russian citizens will respond to changes in the status quo. We also saw a partial version of this with the previously referenced fall 2022 mobilization. But I think that this case is instructive of how the strategic interaction works. The Kremlin realized that the mobilization policy was causing a problem, and they soon shifted to a voluntary recruitment strategy. Still, one could envision a situation where life for the average Russian gets significantly worse. Say, economic instability in the country is leading to bankruptcies in the private sector, leading to wide-scale unemployment, and now clear net negative consequences for those average Russians. However, suppose that information does not make its way up the Kremlin's food chain. Putin, in particular, remains shielded from the information, both because his lieutenants are afraid to report the truth, and because Putin is increasingly isolating himself. The way a well-informed Putin would react to the situation is by scaling back the war, which would provide some relief to the economy. But he is oblivious to what is happening, so there are no adjustments, and then suddenly there are people out on the streets. A broader mystery that plagues all autocratic regimes is how to suppress the few who might try to protest without the safety of a crowd. Governments need to crack down, lest the movement snowball. But security forces have to be careful, lest they go a step too far, and the repression efforts end up backfiring. What does and does not cause a backlash effect is a mystery to everyone involved, and those of us watching from the outside. Never mind that each security agent has a mind of his own and might do something silly. The point is that reaching this stage is not just a function of general citizen dissatisfaction with how the war is going in Ukraine. Rather, what determines protests occurring is dissatisfaction in combination with other measures that the Kremlin takes, some of them in the form of carrots to compensate, and others in the form of sticks to repress. And that is both why we have not yet seen mass protests, and why we cannot know for sure when they will start. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? Domestic unrest in autocratic countries is a bargaining problem. General dispositions for or against a government do not explain whether protests occur, because the government adjusts to how much it can extract from its citizens. The Kremlin, at the moment, is giving average Russians the appropriate carrots and sticks to keep them at home. That may change, but the window for that to happen will not be clear to us ahead of time. Thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring today's video. Head to incogni.com/WilliamSpaniel and use the coupon code WilliamSpaniel to get 60% off an annual plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.